On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning." So they saved it until morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. "Eat it today," Moses said, "because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any." Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out." So the people rested on the 7th day. This is the word of the Lord.
As the last hours of 1879 approached, a train pulled into the station of a remote New Jersey town. Men and women dressed for New Year's Eve celebrations. They were headed not to a party to ring in the next decade, but instead to witness the launch of a new era in human history. And so as passengers looked up in wonder into the night sky, it wasn't to gaze at twinkling stars, but instead at the trail of shining little globes of fire. You see, everyone had come to view the work of the Wizard of Menlo Park, Mr. Thomas Edison. All the guests, they were amazed as they crowded inside of Edison's invention factory for the first public display of his latest invention, the incandescent light bulb. And it was there that the modern world would be changed forever. Now, you see, up until this point, the majority of Americans, they relied on candles or kerosene lanterns or even fireplaces to give light, which, as you can imagine, came with many potential dangers to homes and people. But now, through this invention of a carbon filament lit inside of a pear-shaped bulb, there was a safer, cleaner, and cheaper alternative available. And the Edison Electric Company was formed and began to replace gas in homes and in factories, which meant for the very first time in human history, work was no longer limited to just the time between sunrise and sunset. It was through his invention of light that Thomas Edison invited them into a world that never sleeps, which actually described Edison as he himself didn't sleep much at all. He proudly promoted the idea that success was dependent on staying awake in order to get ahead of the competition. Edison, he was known to work over 100 hours a week. He held job interviews at 4 a.m. And he also insisted that his own employees hold to kind of the same sleepless schedule that he did. He believed rest was a waste of time and the enemy of productivity. The man who gave us the incandescent light bulb thought the world should never turn the lights out at all. Well, it appears as if Edison got his wish. Sleep deprivation, it's a global health epidemic. And at the top of the list of the people who do not sleep, it's the city that never sleeps, New York. Americans, they're constantly among the top most sleep deprived in the world. Sure, the worries keep us awake at night, but our society rewards those who stay up working or socializing rather than resting. And especially with technology, the work follows us home. The conversations continue online, updates and information, they're constant. We're always tempted to do more or talk more. But is that how it's supposed to be? Today, as we continue in the story of Exodus, we discover that rest is not something to be avoided, but rather rest is something to be enjoyed. Let me catch you up here on what has just happened previously in the story. You see, God has brought his people through the Red Sea. Men, women, boys, and girls, they've watched literally as God has saved them. And as the water crashed down over Pharaoh and his chariots, the Israelites were set free from a life of slavery through the powerful work of God. And there on the shores of the Red Sea, they then worshiped and gave praise to God for all that he had done and all that he would continue to do for them. They were on a spiritual high, in a sense. Now, imagine you were in that group. Wouldn't you want to keep that going? Wouldn't you want to just ride off into the sunset, almost as if the soundtrack comes on and the credits start to roll as the Israelites now walk from the shores into the promised land? Well, that's not exactly what happened. We read in the story of Exodus that God led them straight into the desert. The wilderness. But you see, the desert was necessary for their growth. The desert was necessary for forming God's people into the people that he wanted them to be. You know, it's been said that it took one night to get the Israelites out of Egypt, and it would take 40 years to get Egypt out of the Israelites. Think about it. The people, in a sense, they had no idea how to live outside of Egypt. And for the past 430 years, the Israelites, they didn't have options on how to spend their time or how to live without someone telling them what to do and how to do it. And what would happen if they didn't do it? They were forced to obey Pharaoh, this king who thought he was God over all the land. Now, over the course of the events that we read through the book of Exodus, we see as Yahweh demonstrated time and time again that he was over Pharaoh and Egypt and every other god or element. God proved that he was the one true God, that he was like no other. There's no equal in his power and in his strength, as well as in his character. You see, instead of forcing his people to comply and forcing them to obey, God invited the Israelites into their newfound freedom to follow him because of his goodness, to follow him because of his faithfulness to his promises. But you see, in order for them to grow in their dependency on God, in order for them to learn to trust him and follow in obedience, not because they were forced to, but because they were free to. They needed to go through the wilderness. They needed to experience difficulty in order to mature in their faith. Listen, it's one thing. It's one thing to sing praises to Yahweh, their deliverer, in the good times on the shores of the Red Sea. But it was another thing to live out that faith when the difficulties and the hardships came with ordinary life. You see, the wilderness seems to be so counterintuitive, but it was necessary because the lessons learned would set the foundation for the rest of their relationship with Yahweh until they reached the promised land. The relationship before between the God of Egypt, Pharaoh, was transactional. The people earned his approval. But the relationship with Yahweh was completely different. No longer were they measured by what they did. Instead, their acceptance was given based on what God did. What God did. And so today, as we continue in our series in the book of Exodus, we discover together that because of the work of God, that we have rest. Now, remember in the desert, the people needed food, they needed water. And so God provided miraculously for them by giving them bread or manna every single day. Everyone was to go out and to gather as much bread as they needed each and every morning. And then in Exodus chapter 16, verse 21, we read that each morning everyone gathered as much as they needed. And when the sun grew hot, it melted away. It melted away. Nothing more, nothing less, just enough bread. And if they tried to stuff their pockets for a late night snack, filthy bugs and rotting stench would replace that excess manna. They couldn't do it. That is, with the exception of the sixth day. Here in Exodus verse 22, we read, on the sixth day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. Now, it seems as if the people were impressed by how much manna there was available for each person because the leaders announced it to Moses. They ran to him and kind of were telling them just how much was available. There were 2 omers, which was about 6 pounds per person. It's a decent amount of bread. And so the people were used to gathering what they needed. But here on the 6th day, they collected twice as much. And this is why. Verse 23, we continue and it says, he said to them, this is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until the morning. The word Sabbath literally means to cease or stop. The Israelites, they were told to take a day, stop ordinary work, and use that time instead for Yahweh. It's completely countercultural. For any leader or society to demand that their people rest instead of work, pause instead of produce, was completely unheard of at that time. And so this Sabbath, this day of rest, would distinguish God apart from all other gods. And the Sabbath rest would distinguish God's people from all other people. And so to live out this command would be countercultural. But here in this text, I think we can see 2 action steps that guides God's people to observe the Sabbath. The first is to resist the demand to do. And second, to receive the gift to be. First, resist the demand to do. Here in verse 24, we read, so they saved it, meaning manna, until morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. Eat it today, Moses said, because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. Well, the people got the first part right. Collect all the extra manna. God gave his people a 2-day supply of bread because on the 7th day, this holy Sabbath, was to be a day of rest. Complete contrast to the way of Pharaoh. There was no rest in Egypt. Rather, the Israelites, they had to make bricks from sunrise to sunset, made to produce more and more for Pharaoh. He had them gather more, build more, achieve more, no breaks. And so the Israelites, they worked hard in hopes to satisfy this seemingly an insatiable God of Pharaoh. The way of Egypt was to do more, to have more, to be more. Last week, I was driving on the Southern State Parkway and noticed the impatience with which cars moved in and out of different lanes. Many hoped to find the fastest route through the traffic. Researchers call this lane envy. Lane envy. It's a real thing. The feeling that we have when we look to our left and we see cars zipping past us. We then think we're moving significantly slower than other traffic. But studies show that in all actuality, all the lanes tend to average out to be moving roughly at the same speed. But our perception is that we have to maneuver around the lanes in order to keep up. All that really does is just increase pressure, increase our blood pressure, and increase the possibility of an accident. It really doesn't get us ahead of the others. Many times we feel we have to find the fastest lane in order to get ahead of those around us. And as a result, we're more anxious and we're more stressed than ever. We feel we can't stop working because we're so busy and afraid of falling behind. You talk to most people around you, and the typical response to how someone is doing involves some variation of how full and tiring their life is at the moment. Many of us Many of us are busier than we actually need to be because we feel a need to be successful and accepted. In the past, a beach vacation or taking the afternoon for a round of golf, they were signs of success. But now Americans increasingly perceive busy and overworked people as having high status. Our culture's consumed with work and productivity. And with this obsession, though, comes a restlessness, this demand to do more and to be more. It's found all around us. And so the idea of not working instead of resting, it's so difficult to comprehend or even appreciate, which was the case for the Israelites as well. Here in verse 26 and 27, we read, 6 days you are to gather it. Gather the manna on 6 days, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will not be any. Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather it, but they found none. There were some who just couldn't resist. On that next morning, people were out there working, looking for more bread. Sure, maybe they were out there for a lack of self-control, or just perhaps it was their inability to rest from a lack of trust that God was going to provide for them. But shouldn't some have gotten their attention, though, because of what had happened on day 6? It was exactly what God said would happen. There was going to be extra food and there weren't going to be bugs. I mean, that miracle alone should have been enough to clue the people in to what God was going to do, what he said he was going to do on the seventh day. As in, why are you out here? Why are you out here today acting as if God didn't give you enough yesterday? Why are you living today as if he didn't care for you yesterday? That's me. That's me. I easily forget that our God sees us and cares for us and provides for us. And so we start living as if everything's dependent on us. Sure, we have a part to play in caring for ourselves and our loved ones. Work, yes, and work hard. But we don't need to work all the time. We have to accept that we're limited beings and that we're made in the image of a restful God. Our God rested. Our God's not a workaholic. He's not anxious or worrisome about how he's going to keep it all together. He knew the work that he had done was sufficient. It was good. And so he rested. Now, in order to rest, we have to resist the demand to do, because then we actively practice that we're not God, that the world does not depend on us, but rather it depends on God. He's the one who keeps this world going, not us. Not us. God is at work all around us while we rest. God is at work in us and through us as we rest. And so because God never sleeps, we can. Because God is always at work. So first, we need to resist the demand to do. Secondly, we receive the gift to be. Receive the gift to be. Verse 29 here we read, says that, bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are. On the 7th day, no one is to go out. So the people rested on the 7th day. Notice that Yahweh gave Sabbath to his people. Our God is a generous God. Unlike Pharaoh, where they never got rest and the brick quota increased. But with Yahweh, instead of having to produce double, he provided double. What a huge contrast. You see, God gave rest and he gave bread. Not because they earned it or they deserved it. These were gifts, and they weren't dependent on how hard the Israelites worked that week or how much manna they collected or what their attitude was. These gifts were not based on merit, but on grace. You see, God graciously gave rest because he loved them, and they were his children. They were no longer slaves in Egypt. And so every week as the people rested from work, it was a reminder they were no longer under a hard taskmaster, no longer obligated to produce something in order to live. They were of significant worth, not because of what they do, but simply because of who they be. Now, forgive me, I know that's not correct grammar, but listen, the Israelites were loved simply for being them. They received rest not because they did something. They received rest because God gave it. Our dog, Desmond, is a 1-year-old puppy. He is, I think, 110% extrovert. And I'm pretty sure that if someone walked into our home to take all that we had, he would wag his tail and probably show them all around the place. But you see, we don't love Desmond because of his production value, what he does for us. We love him simply because he exists. Now, the same is true of our kids. They are not particularly productive either. They play with their toys. They jump on the trampoline. They ride their scooters. They don't do the laundry. They don't have a job. They don't bring home a paycheck. They don't help provide the food that they eat. They don't pay for it. But they are so dearly loved because they are our children. You see, we're loved by our Creator, not because of what we do for Him. Not because of what we do for Him. We're loved actually before we did anything. We're loved because we exist. We read here in Exodus 16 that everyone stayed where they are on the seventh day. That seems like punishment, not a gift. Not being able to go anywhere sounds more like prison than freedom. And over the years, Sabbath has been made into a list of do's and don'ts. And many times leaders added to what God said in order to kind of measure or control. And so in doing so, Sabbath became about achieving and doing, which completely missed the point. And then there are others who have swung the pendulum the other way and have thrown, in a sense, the baby out with the bathwater, claiming that it's no longer necessary to observe the Sabbath because we no longer are under the law of Moses because we're followers of Jesus. But from this text here in Exodus, we see that Sabbath rest was actually established before the law of Moses. Or perhaps somewhere in between. We have been made to believe that Sabbath is just about a 1.5-hour church service. And if we have, again, achieved and accomplished our duty of attendance on Sabbath, then we get on with more important things of the day. That too misses the point. You see, the heart of Sabbath was not to restrict, but to liberate the people of God, to enjoy the relationship they had with Yahweh, the relationship they had with family and the community, the relationship they had with the creation. You see, Sabbath rest was to be enjoyed, not because they had to, but because they got to. Look here in verse 30 again, it says, "So the people rested on the seventh day." They did it. The people stopped. They paused, just as God commanded. And later, when God gave the laws on Mount Sinai, and observing the Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments listed. God took the Sabbath pretty seriously because it would define his people. It would define his people not as slaves, but as children. You see, the identity of the people of God, it's not about how much they have done, how much they've earned. The identity of the people of God was by how much God has done and how much he has given. So how do we enjoy this gift of Sabbath? Sabbath is a gift that we do not have to impress or achieve. Sabbath, it's a gift that God will provide for us, that God will take care of our needs. With Sabbath, we're free to worship, free to trust, free to take regular scheduled time to not gain or achieve, but be. Sabbath was countercultural then just as much as it is now. And Sabbath is not simply a day off, not simply just a day off from work. In some ways, that's a whole lot easier than purposely choosing to not participate in the busyness and the pursuit of more, to not spend time producing more and consuming more. We need rest, a pause from the demand, and a reminder that it's not how the people of God form their identity. Our kids are in kindergarten and first grade, and at this age, their social life basically consists of birthday parties for their classmates and friends, which seems to be almost every weekend. There's a few unique parties that we've attended, but for the most part, all the parties have kind of this similar schedule. There's a sport or a craft or a game, and then there's pizza and singing, and then cake. And if that wasn't enough stimulation for 1 hour, then comes time for the piñata. If you have ever witnessed the birthday party piñata, you know that from the looks of every child's face, it seems as if the gold and puppies were about to fall out of it. And they all stand around and they're embracing themselves in anticipation for what they believe is going to be the best candy and trinkets of all time. So as the piñata bursts open, all the kids rush in and grab by the fistfuls as much goodies as they can. And now looking from the outside, it kind of looks ridiculous as the kids kind of like clamor all over the place in hopes to get as much candy so everyone can fill up their little bags. They're still grabbing and searching as if they're not going to have enough. Our Father who's the author of all good things, he has given us enough. We don't have to spend each and every day clamoring for more and more and more. Instead, because of all that God has done, we rest in confidence that God sees, that he cares, and that he provides. And so God invites us to be with him, to take a day of the week or an afternoon or a block of time and to simply enjoy his gifts, to spend time being with him and other people, to experience joy in many different ways. What Sabbath looks like can vary as much as those watching here. Joy might be from washing the car or cutting the grass or walking the dog, cooking, talking with friends, playing sports, or so much more. But when that joy turns into getting ahead or being more or seeming to beat out those around us, we know that it's no longer the gift to be enjoyed. Sabbath, it's the chance to break up the routine and the pursuit to receive from God and to be renewed by him, to be renewed by the blessings in our life. Sabbath, it's the opportunity to spend time in worship and in thanksgiving for what God has done and what God will continue to do for us. Now, don't tell me it can't be done. You can't schedule time for rest. If I was to look at all of our calendars, my guess is that we've noted our medical appointments and our business meetings and our parties and our weddings. We don't think twice about scheduling time to care for our health or for work and for family celebrations. And so just the same way, we need to be purposeful about building time to step away from the demand of more, the demand of more to be, and to instead enjoy, to rest. Deep down, no matter who you are, we all crave this kind of rest. Jesus extended the invitation to all those who would follow. And in Matthew 11, he says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. He invites all those to take his yoke upon them, for he's gentle and humble, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. You see, we follow a Lord who does not ask us to carry his burdens and demands. Instead, we have a Savior who came to his people, who took the weight of sin and shame and died on the cross in order to set us free from slavery, the slavery of sin. And instead, he invites each and every one of us to come to him. He wants to give us rest. Rest for our weary souls, rest from the striving and the earning and the achieving of love and worth. He loved us before we even loved him. He's gentle and he's humble. And in Jesus, we find the ultimate rest that our souls long for. We just need to come to him, to trust in him and rest in his work. Thomas Edison was fully bought into the demand of doing more, into having more. His light bulb invention allowed for him and many others for more work and less sleep. And that idea has kind of carried us through the years, and for the most part, it controls our society today. Now, Thomas Edison may have brought more light, But along with it came sleeplessness and restlessness and stress and anxiety. But you see, we were not made for that pursuit. It was St. Augustine who correctly said, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." We don't have to endlessly pursue more in hopes to find rest. We just need to receive what God has made available to us through the work of Jesus Christ. And as his people, we're invited into another way of living. So we receive the gift of Sabbath as sons and daughters of Yahweh, not as slaves to a system of doing more and earning more and being more. You see, we've been rescued from that, rescued and delivered from this rat race of finding significance by what we do. Our divine creator, the one who first said, "Let there be light," has graciously also said, "Let there be rest." So come to him today. Come to him today and find your rest for your soul.